When I think back over all of my reviews in the last 5 years, I must have looked at least 40, maybe even 50 different two-way stand mount speakers, ranging in price from about £300 up to about £20,000. And they've all been different, but a lot of them have shared a common theme or maybe a common style or type of voicing. But I can sit here with no exaggeration and say that I've never listened to a speaker quite like the AVID EVO 4s that you can see there behind me. So if this is your speaker type of choice and you're really struggling to find some that tick all of your boxes, well then maybe these will be it. I first heard and saw AVID's EVO 4 speakers at a hi-fi show several years ago, but it's taken them this long, several years, for them to be ready for prime time. And initially I must say I really like the look of them. I think they are very cool with that thick aluminium front baffle design and the way that's been styled. I really like that, but even cooler is the rear. The rear has an aluminium panel too, but what's on that aluminium panel, the British logo and everything there, the way that's all designed, the really high quality, nice and custom speaker cable terminals. I just think that's a really nice touch of quality, and it's such a shame really that it's normally most of the time hidden away. And to me, the EVO 4 are a really unusual design. Yes, they have a typical, in a way, 1.5-inch soft dome tweeter and a 6-inch mid-bass driver. But the shape of the speaker is small fronted, for which there are obvious benefits, but then the speakers are really very deep at 17.5 inches, so they will likely require custom stands. And they have legs supporting the speaker body because they are bottom ported. So you can see they are different, but I want to start by really talking about speaker voicing in general because it's relevant to everyone. And if you're considering a speaker at this price level, which is £8,000, this is unlikely to be your first rodeo. And you probably already know what you like and maybe what you don't like, although you should always be open-minded. And there is a common type of speaker voicing strategy where the designer will roll off the treble some and raise the bass some. In what region the bass is raised will depend on what type of sound the speaker designer is going for, but this is a very common strategy. Like that, tip that way. And I've seen it in speakers at different price points. It's definitely not only a more affordable strategy, it's used to create a certain type of sound. And that sound or the strategy is to make a speaker that sounds more pleasing, to make it sound smoother, to make it sound warmer, and maybe bolder, or maybe even larger. And I think this type of sound voicing has been studied and proven to be very popular across a lot of people. But clearly it's not for everybody, otherwise that would be the only speaker that manufacturers make and the only speakers that we all listen to. And that's clearly not the case in either situation. But it is a strategy that I find nice. I do really find pleasing, a certain variation of it. But I often find I like this sound, but I find the treble to be a little bit too soft. And you might have heard me say that in reviews before. And so much so that I've been considering getting or looking into super tweeters to give me more control over this. Then I have to think about age. As we get older, maybe we will start to lose our higher frequencies. So having some speakers that are more or have some more higher frequency energy could be a really good thing. The whole point of me discussing this is to try and create some better context for the EVO 4's voicing, because when I first listened to them, it seemed to me like AVID had tried to create a speaker that disappeared and imaged like a panel speaker, but with more bite and grit and attack at both frequency extremes. And to describe their sound, I think I should start with the EVO 4's biggest strengths, and that is their clarity and transparency or three-dimensional soundstage, because the EVO 4 totally disappear and they present an ultra-precise soundstage with fantastic layering and organisation, creating a wonderful sense of space with speed and articulation and very present micro details. And they sound very open and very expansive for their higher frequencies, something that speakers with a more rolled off treble just don't do at all. And this is obviously in large part due to the tweeter, which is made from silk with a special damping compound applied called AccuFlex, which is used to help to cancel breakup that causes distortion. And I think the tweeter is really something for just how precise and articulate it delivers information so clearly and so very present. And silk dome tweeters do seem to have, even when they're very energetic, just a slightly softer and slightly sweeter and slightly more rounded way to present higher frequency information, I think anyway, compared to metal tweeters. And the way that the tweeter has been voiced in the EVO 4 speakers definitely puts them right on the front foot for transient clarity. And by that I mean the way music is kind of etched or edged within, imagine a very clear open soundstage. Each musical element really is kind of drawn very, very clearly defined across the soundstage, which makes them great for electronic music, which I listen to a lot, and I think likely great for classical too, but I don't really listen to much classical music personally. But there is a but here, and I'll get to that shortly. And a 6-inch driver in a good size enclosure is enough to give you some good bass. And very good and very tight bass is what the EVO 4 deliver. The bass is almost as articulate as the treble, not quite, but almost. The EVO 4 have been designed to have a fairly flat bass response, so it's subtle when it's supposed to be and bigger when called for. And it can be surprisingly big. But will you need a subwoofer with them? And that's a really interesting question, because a really good pair of subwoofers is always great to add to any pair of speakers. But I think it will depend on the size of your room and the type of system and its sound and the synergy, how it works with the speakers. But I would say maybe you would want to add subwoofers, but I definitely didn't feel I definitely needed to add them. And the EVO 4 are not a small speaker, even though they seem it because of their design. But they are still not a large speaker either, and the bass is very impressive for their size. But there is also a but here with the bass as well. Both buts relates to vocals delivery, and the EVO 4's crossover between the tweeter and the mid-bass driver is around 2 kHz, which is quite low, but also quite common for a lot of modern speakers. But whenever I hear a speaker that has a lower crossover point, like around 2 kHz, I always find the tops of vocals sound very clear and precise, but also just a little bit more crispy. And I do like it to a point, but it can take some getting used to, especially when you've been listening to maybe some paper driver speakers or some polypropylene driver speakers with a slightly higher crossover. Because I find with those speakers, the tops of vocals just sound a little bit softer, a little bit smoother, and a little bit more rounded. Maybe not as clear, or maybe not as well resolved for information, but not as crispy either. And then when you combine this with the flat type of bass response, intended bass response of the EVO 4s that does have a bit of a recession around 200 Hz, I found that some male vocals just don't sound as bold and as full and as solid as maybe I've heard from other speakers around this type of price point. And I'm thinking of the Martin Parker duos, because they have a very strong, bold type of sound. But I do love how the EVO 4 carved the vocals out in space in the soundstage, again with fantastic clarity and detail, that fantastic edge detail. And the treble profile of the EVO 4 will be better represented with a graph of how the speakers measured in my room. And you can see the tweeter rising from 2 kHz. It's very smooth, but there is a fair few dBs worth of rise happening, up to about 10 kHz. And this means in some music there is fantastic amounts of ambience, and cymbals can really shimmer. And with electronic music, the higher frequency details really pop. But with other music like The Streets, the original Pirate Material album, the music becomes very treble-led, and I think it gets in the way a bit as it dominates. And even in sections of a softer song in the main like Cristel Alsos, If You Knew Me Now, the treble details become a bit too hot in places, and again dominates too much for me at the loud type of volumes I generally listen at. But listening at lower volumes, it is quite a different experience because our ears are naturally less sensitive, so maybe there is something in that. And there are other speakers that have this type of treble profile when I'm thinking of Sonus Faber speakers, and the famous one is Bowers and Wilkins. And Bowers 805 D4 obviously becomes, I suppose, the main competitor or comparison really for the Evo 4 speakers. And you might be thinking, what makes the Evo 4 stand out compared to a speaker like the Bowers 805? Well, interestingly, it might be things that you can't see. And the whole AVID concept for all of their products is to remove what they call bad vibration, which makes sense in a turntable but also makes sense in a speaker. The thick, solid aluminium baffle makes sense for being a very inert front of a speaker to mount a driver to. But what you can't see is the drivers are mounted inside the speaker on an aluminium frame system with a built-in vibration damping solution AVID call TMT, Tunes Mass Technology, which essentially absorbs the mechanical vibration of the driver and stops it going into the cabinet. And of course, the pressure from the driver moving backwards and forwards, the back pressure will obviously still go into the cabinet because we need it to create sound. But what the AVID TMT system does is it stops that the actual mechanical vibration of the driver pressure, all that pressure moving its way into the cabinet, which will then make the cabinet vibrate, which will then add itself to the sound, so it will smear and colour the sound. But I've got no way of testing this particular system and how effective it is. But I did do some comparative listening with my current reference speakers, the Mission 770s. And of course, it's a chalk and cheese comparison really, but the Mission, again, do have a very inert cabinet and do disappear very well. But compared to the AVID, you can hear sound coming from a large speaker. You don't hear any sound coming from the Evo 4. They totally disappear, and I'm sure that's partly why they cost 3 times as much. But the comparison was also very interesting because the Mission 770 have exactly the voicing I mentioned earlier, bold in the bass and softer in the top. And it's very cool and interesting to listen between these speakers as one shows off the main strengths of the other and vice versa. The Mission's big strength is they create a big sound. Very pleasing with a big solid bass for a stand mount speaker, and they present higher frequency information with nice sparkle too, but it's a softer sparkle, and their vocals, they are just awesome. And they can also sound very three-dimensional with the right music. Whereas the AVID sound three-dimensional with all music, just because of how well they disappear and how much space and organisation and layering they create within the soundstage. And they have a lot more high-frequency energy, which makes them sound faster and livelier, and large too, but in a different way. And their bass is tighter than the Mission's, not by much, and it's music dependent. And the vocals sound crisper, but not as smooth and as pleasing for me in the main. And using the Rings of Power Season 1 soundtrack showed me the differences really very clearly, with the AVID I think being great for the orchestral pieces because their clarity and energy really shows off the upper dynamic reaches of the music. And the Missions sound very subdued in comparison, but also very warm and bold, which sounded great for track 4, Khazad-dûm, that has strong male vocals and a lot of dwarf boldness to the track. And this really is a beautiful album to listen to on a really good hi-fi system. And that is the real kicker here to this situation. With the Missions, I think they are a very easy speaker to find a good system synergy. And I think that whole speaker voicing is very good for that. Of course, definitely different systems are going to give you different sounds and different qualities of sound. But I think the delta difference is not quite as big, and they always have, I suppose, a higher standard of sound. Whereas the AVID EVO 4 I found really quite fussy in terms of trying to find a perfect sound synergy. I think that's part of the design, a really high resolution, really clear, really lively, really present type of sound. I think that type of speaker is always going to be trickier to find a good system synergy for. while we are talking system synergy, I also have here to review AVID's Sigsum integrated amplifier. Inside the Sigsum is also AVID's Pulsus phono stage, which is about a £2,000 phono stage. And I also have an AVID turntable, the Ingenium plug and play. So there should be maximum synergy here between everything coming from the one manufacturer, and that definitely was the case. And it was still a very lively upfront sound, but I found the overall balance of the higher frequencies to be better than with my digital setup. And I have the Street's original pirate material on vinyl too, so I could compare it to the digital, and digital was streaming from Cobuzz. And yeah, the vinyl sound was definitely a better balance. Still treble led, a little bit more treble led than I think was ideal, but definitely a better balance. And that treble led aspect could well be the cartridge or the turntable itself, but I think, you know, the balance of the speakers is also involved in that. But I also listened to Adele 25, obviously I have that on vinyl too, and this is quite mixed, quite hot, isn't it? We all know that the digital especially is mixed really quite hot. And again, listening to it on vinyl through this system, through the speakers, I think the vinyl version, or the way it's mastered on vinyl, sounded better. It made more sense. Lively, energetic, very expressive. Sounded really good actually. I'm really surprised at how good this vinyl sounds. I was expecting it to be a little rough, but no, this is a really good one. It sounded good through the system. But the magic one was this, Cold to Wall. And listening to this through the system, through the Evo 4 speakers, this is quite a soft, sultry type of album, but the energy, the expression, the size and the scale and the ambience, I think it was the ambience that was coming through off this pressing, off this album. I suppose the moral of this part of the story is that vinyl sounded excellent in the main. And I can see more about why the speakers have this type of voicing, because it gives vinyl really great liveliness and verve, which I like. And I think this type of sound character will work really nicely with a lot of turntable setups where they are a little bit more relaxed, they are a little bit more reserved, they are trying to be very, very analog sounding. But I think this type of sound character, just like everything else in hi-fi, won't be for everybody. And I'm going to explore this more in the Sigsum amplifier review that will be coming soon. So to sum up this very long review, I think audiophiles can legitimately ask this very important question to themselves. Should I buy the AVID EVO 4 over the Bowers & Wilkins 805 D4? And the reason I'm using the Bowers is because of their popularity, familiarity. I'm sure most of you have probably heard some 805s, some more modern 805s at some point. And because they are the only speaker that I can really think of that has a similar type of voice and a treble profile. Not the same, but similar. So it makes them very much an apples to apples comparison. But there is a fairly hefty price difference of about £1,000. So the AVID do cost about £1,000 more. But if you really like the Bowers & Wilkins type of sound, well then I think you should definitely also audition the AVID EVO 4 because of the similarities, but also probably more because of the differences, because there are some stark differences to how both of these speakers sound. And of course you might prefer the way the Evo 4s present the music, the clarity, the spaciousness, the real fine, crisp, fine details, and their three-dimensionality. Those characteristics are really very impressive and really very addictive. But I suppose for everybody else, if you're looking for a big, warm, cuddly, what I call a pipe and slippers type of speaker, the AVID EVO 4 are definitely not it. But if you want a speaker that has a bit more about them, they're a bit more lively, a bit more energetic, a bit more upfront, well then, like I said, the AVID EVO 4 are very impressive in some really key areas. But like all things in hi-fi, and especially when you're shopping for speakers at this kind of level, it's the fine details, it's the really fine details that means a speaker might be the perfect one for you or not. Bearing in mind, no, perfect does not exist, which is why we are in pursuit of it. So I hope you've enjoyed this review. I hope you found it useful and helpful. If you enjoyed it, please hit the thumbs up button. If you'd like to see more reviews like this, especially of the AVID Sigsum integrated amplifier, that review will be coming soon. If you're interested to see that, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for watching all the way to the end.